revisiting the big conspiracy theories that I have already done videos on, but I believe this one I did was right back when I restarted my channel a good 2 or so years ago. So we're going to be giving, and I think back then I had an awful trim. If I remember the thumbnail, it was certainly brave to put my face out there to the world. So today we're going to be taking a little bit of a more detailed look into the conspiracy theory surrounding the 1969 moon landing. I've always said on the channel, if there's one conspiracy theory that I partially believe in, it is definitely this one. I am, however, going to be kind of debunking the theories as we go, but even the debunking, this is the debunking from the American government, or like technically you can't ever truly prove the debunking. Some of them anyway, some of them you can, some of them are pretty obvious. If I look tired, it is because it is the morning. I never ever film in the morning, and so I've got a nice coffee to see me brew, and I've got the mic a little bit closer and the gain reduced just because there's more background sounds. My partner is getting ready, so if there's a few cuts in this, I apologise, but I needed to get this video recorded before I go away. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the conspiracy theories. So moon landing conspiracy theories claim that some or all elements of the Apollo program and the associated moon landings were hoaxes staged by NASA, possibly with the aid of other organisations. The most notable claim of these conspiracy theories is that the 6 crewed landings, 1969 to 1972, were faked, and that 12 Apollo astronauts did not actually land on the moon. Various groups and individuals have made claims since the mid-1970s that NASA and others knowingly misled the public into believing the landings happened by manufacturing, tampering with, or destroying evidence, including photos, telemetry tapes, radio and TV transmissions, and moon rock samples. Much third-party evidence for the landings exists, and detailed rebuttals to the hoax claims have been made. Since the late 2000s, high-definition photos taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, of the Apollo landing sites have captured the Lunar Module descent stages and the tracks left by the astronauts. In 2012, images were released showing 5 of the 6 Apollo missions' American flags erected on the moon still standing. The exception is that of Apollo 11, which was laying on the lunar surface since being blown over by the Lunar Module ascent propulsion system. Despite the fact they are demonstrably false and universally regarded as pseudoscience, opinion polls taken in various locations have shown that between 6 and 20% of Americans, 25% of Britons, and 28% of Russians surveyed believed that the crewed landings were faked. Even as late as 2001, the Fox television network documentary Conspiracy Theory Did We Land on the Moon claimed NASA faked the first landing in 1969 to win the space race. So, origins of these theories. An early and influential book about the subject of a moon landing conspiracy, We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle, was self-published in 1976 by Bill Kaysing, a former US Navy officer with a Bachelor of Arts in English. Despite having no knowledge of rockets or technical writing, Kaysing was hired as a senior technical writer in 1956 by Rocketdyne, the company that built the F-1 engines used on the Saturn V rocket. He a successful crewed landing on the moon was calculated to be 0.0017%, and that despite close monitoring by the USSR, it would have been easier for NASA to fake the moon landings than to really go there. In 1980, the Flat Earth Society accused NASA of faking the landings, arguing they were staged by Hollywood with Walt Disney sponsorship, based on a script by Arthur C. Clarke and directed by Stanley Kubrick. You know, if there's an organisation that is the epitome of truth and knowledge, it is always the Flat Earth Society. Folklorist Linda Day suggests that writer-director Peter Hyams' film Capricorn 1, which shows a hoaxed journey to Mars in a spacecraft that looks identical to the Apollo craft, might have given a boost to the hoax theory's popularity in the post-Vietnam War era. Day sees a parallel with other attitudes during the post-Watergate era, when the American public were inclined to distrust official accounts. Day writes, the mass media catapult these half-truths into a kind of twilight zone, where people can make their guesses sound as truths. Mass media have a terrible impact on people who lack guidance. In A Man on the Moon, first published in 1994, Andrew Chaikin mentions that at the time of Apollo 8's lunar orbit mission in December 1968, similar conspiracy ideas were already in circulation. So, those who believe the moon landings were faked offer several theories about the motives of NASA and the US government. The three main theories are as follows. So we begin with the space race. Motivation for the United States to engage the Soviet Union in a space race can be traced to the Cold War. Landing on the moon was viewed as a national and technological accomplishment that would generate worldwide acclaim. But going to the moon would be risky and expensive, as exemplified by President John F. Kennedy famously stating in a 1962 speech that the US chose to go because it was hard. Hoax theory debunker Phil Blait says in his 2002 book Bad Astronomy that the Soviets, with their own competing moon program, an extensive intelligence network and a formidable science community able to analyse NASA data, would have cried foul if the US tried to fake a moon landing, especially since their own program had failed. Proving a hoax would have been a huge propaganda win for the Soviets. Instead, far from calling the landings a hoax, the third edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which was translated into English between 1974 and 1983, contained many articles reporting the landings as factual, such as its article on Neil Armstrong. Indeed, their article on space exploration describes the Apollo 11 landing as the third historic event of the space age, following the launch of Sputnik in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961. Conspiracist Bart Sibrel responded incorrectly, asserting that the Soviets did not have the capability to track deep spacecraft until 1972, immediately after which the last three Apollo missions were abruptly cancelled. Those missions were cancelled, not abruptly, but for cost-cutting reasons. The announcements were made in January and September 1970, 2 full years before the late 1972 claimed by Sibrel. In fact, the Soviets had been sending uncrewed spacecraft to the moon since 1959, and during 1962, deep space tracking facilities were introduced to IP-15 in Usurisk and IP-16 in Evpatoria, while Saturn communication the Soviet Union tracked the Apollo missions at the Space Transmission Corps, which was fully equipped with the latest intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment. Vasily Mishin, in an interview for the article "The Moon Program That Folded," describes how the Soviet moon program dwindled after the Apollo landings. In May 2023, Dmitry Rogozin, former director of the Russian space agency Roscosmos, expressed doubt that US astronauts landed on the moon. He complained of not receiving a satisfactory answer when he asked his agency to provide evidence. He said his colleagues at Roscosmos were angry about his questions and did not want to undermine cooperation with NASA. Next theory, origin, motive, that's the one I was looking for, is NASA funding and prestige. Conspiracy theorists claim that NASA faked the landings to avoid humiliation and to ensure that it continued to get funding. NASA raised about $30 billion to go to the moon, and Casing claimed in his book that this could have been used to pay off many people. Since most conspiracists believed that sending men to the moon was impossible at the time, they argued that landings had to be faked to fulfill Kennedy's 1961 goal. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. In fact, NASA accounted for the cost of Apollo to the US Congress in 1973, totaling $25.4 billion. Mary Bennett and David Percy claimed in the 2001 book Dark Moon, Apollo and the Whistleblowers that with all the known and unknown hazards, NASA would not risk broadcasting an astronaut getting sick or dying on live TV. The counter-argument generally given is that NASA in fact did incur a great deal of public humiliation and potential political opposition to the program by losing an entire crew in the Apollo 1 fire during a ground test, leading to its upper management team being questioned by Senate and House of Representatives space oversight committees. There was in fact no video broadcast during either the landing or takeoff because of technological limitations. And third, we have the Vietnam War. The American Patriot Friends Network claimed in 2009 that the landings helped the United States government distract public attention from the incredibly unpopular Vietnam War. And so crewed landings suddenly ended about the same time that the US ended its involvement in the war. In fact, the ending of the landings was not sudden. The war was one of several federal budget items with which NASA had to compete. NASA's budget peaked in 1966 and fell by 42% by 1972. This was the reason the final flights were cut, along with plans for even more ambitious follow-on programs, such as permanent space station and crewed flight to Mars. Okay, so we move on now to hoax claims and rebuttals. And what I'll do here is, hopefully I'll find the time to, because there have been a few instances where I've forgotten to do so, but when there's like a specific bit of evidence, I will try to find it and I will throw it on screen for you. Okay, so many moon landing conspiracy theories have been proposed, alleging that the landings either did not occur and NASA staff lied, or that the landings did occur, but not in the way that has been reported. Conspiracists have focused on perceived gaps or inconsistencies in the historical record of the missions. The foremost idea is that the whole crewed landing program was a hoax from start to end, technology to send men to the moon was lacking, or that the Van Allen radiation belts, solar flares, solar wind, coronal mass ejections, and cosmic rays made such a trip impossible. Vince Calder and Andrew Johnson, scientists from Argonne National Laboratory, have given detailed answers to conspiracists' claims on the laboratory's website. They show that NASA's portrayal of the moon landing is fundamentally accurate, allowing for such common mistakes as mislabeled photos and imperfect personal recollections. Using the scientific process, any hypothesis that is contradicted by the observable facts may be rejected. The real landing hypothesis is a single story, since it comes from a single source, but there is no unity in the hoax hypotheses, because hoax accounts vary between conspiracists. So, we begin with photographic and film oddities. Moon landing conspiracists focus heavily on NASA photos. They point to oddities in photos and films taken on the moon. Photography experts have replied that the oddities are consistent with what should be expected from a real moon landing, and are not consistent with tweaked or studio imagery. Some main arguments and counter-arguments are listed here. So, in some photos, the crosshairs appear to be behind objects. The cameras were fitted with a Rousseau plate, a clear glass plate with a reticle etched on, making it impossible for any photographed object to appear in front of the grid. Conspiracists often use this evidence to suggest that objects were pasted over the photographs, and hence obscure the reticle. And the rebuttal is this effect only appears in copied and scanned photos, not any originals. It's caused by overexposure. The bright white areas of the emulsion bleed over the thin black crosshairs. The crosshairs are only about 0.004 inches thick. An emulsion would only have to bleed about half that much to fully obscure it. Furthermore, there are many photos where the middle of the crosshair is washed out, but the rest is intact. In some photos of the American flag, parts of one crosshair appear on the red stripes, but parts of the same crosshair are faded or invisible on the white stripes. There would have been no reason to paste white stripes onto the flag. Number 2, crosshairs are sometimes rotated or in the wrong place. The rebuttal: this is a result of popular photos being cropped and or rotated for aesthetic impact. Number 3, the quality of the photographs is implausibly high. There are many poor quality photos taken by the Apollo astronauts, but NASA only chose to publish the best examples apparently. The Apollo astronauts used high-resolution NASA-Plaid 500 EL cameras with Carl Zeiss optics and a 70mm medium-format film magazine. Nolan will be proud. Number 4, there are no stars in any of the photos. The Apollo 11 astronauts also stated in post-mission press conferences that they did not remember seeing any stars during extravehicular activity. Conspiracists contend that NASA chose not to put the stars into the photos because astronomers would have been able to use them to determine whether the photos were taken from the Earth or the Moon, by means of identifying them and comparing their celestial position, and parallax to what would be expected for either observation site. And the rebuttal is the astronauts were talking about naked eye sightings of stars during the lunar daytime. They regularly sighted stars through the spacecraft navigation optics while aligning their inertial reference platforms, the Apollo PGNCS. Stars are rarely seen in Space Shuttle, sun and by sunlight reflected off the moon's surface. The astronauts' eyes were adapted to the sunlit landscape around them so that they could not see the relatively faint stars. The astronauts could see stars with the naked eye only when they were in the shadow of the moon. Number 5. The angle and colour of shadows are inconsistent. This suggests that artificial lights were used. Shadows on the moon are complicated by reflected light, uneven ground, wide-angle lens distortion and lunar dust. There are several light sources: the sun, sunlight reflected from the Earth, sunlight reflected from the moon's surface, and sunlight reflected from the astronauts and the lunar module. Light from these sources is scattered by lunar dust in many directions, including into shadows. Shadows falling into craters and hills may appear longer, shorter and distorted. Furthermore, shadows display the properties of vanishing point perspective, leading them to converge to a point on the horizon. Number 6. There are identical backgrounds in photos which, according to their captions, were taken miles apart. This suggests that a painted background was used. The rebuttalist backgrounds were not identical, just similar. What appear as nearby hills in some photos are actually mountains many miles away. On Earth, objects that are further away will appear fainter and less detailed. On the moon, there is no atmosphere or haze to obscure far-away objects, thus they appear clearer and nearer. Furthermore, there are very few objects, such as trees, to help judge distance. One such case is debunked in Who Mourns for Apollo by Mike Barra. Number 7. The number of photos taken is implausibly high, up to 1 photo per 50 seconds. Simplified gear with fixed settings allowed 2 photos a second. Many were taken immediately after each other as stereo pairs or panorama sequences. The calculation 1 per 50 seconds was based on a lone astronaut on the surface, and does not take into account that there were 2 astronauts sharing the workload and simultaneously taking photographs during an EVA. The photos contain artifacts, like the 2 seemingly matching C's on a rock and on the ground. These may be labelled studio props. And the rebuttal is the C-shaped objects are most likely printing imperfections and do not appear in the original film from the camera. It has been suggested that the C is a coiled hair. Number 9. A resident of Perth in Western Australia, a woman named Una Ronald, said that for 2 or 3 seconds she saw a Coca-Cola bottle roll across the lower right quadrant of her television screen that was displaying the live broadcast of the Apollo 11. She also said that several letters appeared in the West Australian discussing the Coca-Cola bottle incident within 10 days of the lunar landing. But the rebuttal is, no such newspaper reports or recordings have been found. Ronald's claims have only been relayed by one source. There are also flaws in the story, e.g. the statement that she had to stay up late to watch the moon landing live is easily discounted by many witnesses in Australia who watched the landing in the middle of the daytime. That just reminds me of, in Game of Thrones where they left the Starbucks cup, except this probably, would have been on a slightly more bigger scale, more serious scale. The 1994 book Moonshot contains an obviously fake composite photo of Alan Shepard hitting a golf ball on the moon with another astronaut. That makes it sound like he's using the astronaut as a golf club. The rebuttal is it was used instead of the only existing real images from the TV monitor, which the editors seemingly felt were too grainy for their book. The book publishers did not work for NASA, although the authors were retired NASA astronauts. At number 11, there appeared to be hot spots in some photos that looked like a large spotlight was used in place of the sun. But the rebuttalist bits on the moon's surface focus and reflect light like the tiny glass spheres used in the coating of street signs or dewdrops on wet grass. This creates a glow around the photographer's own shadow when it appears in a photograph. Okay, next section we move on to environment. Conspiracists have taken issue with the environment. So number 1, the astronauts could not have survived the trip because of exposure to radiation from the Van Allen radiation belt and galactic ambient radiation. As my stomach decides to join in, some conspiracists have suggested that Starfish Prime, a high-altitude nuclear test in 1962, formed another intense layer of the Van Allen belt. But the counter-argument: there are two main Van Allen belts, the inner belt and the outer belt, and a transient third belt. The inner belt is the more dangerous one, containing energetic protons. The outer one has less dangerous low-energy electrons. The Apollo spacecraft passed through the inner belt in a matter of minutes, and the outer belt in about 1.5 hours. The astronauts were shielded from the ionizing radiation by the aluminium hulls of the spacecraft. Furthermore, the orbital transfer trajectory from Earth to the Moon through the belts was chosen to lessen radiation exposure. Even James Van Allen, the discoverer of the belt, rebutted the claims that radiation levels were too harmful for the Apollo missions. Phil Plait cited an average dose of less than 1 rem, which is equivalent to the ambient radiation received by living at sea level for 3 years. The total radiation received on the trip was about the same as allowed for workers in the nuclear energy field for a year, and not much more than what Space Shuttle astronauts received. Number 2, film in the cameras would have been fogged by this radiation. In the counter-argument, the film was kept in metal containers that stopped radiation from fogging the film's emulsion. Furthermore, film carried by uncrewed lunar probes such as the Lunar Orbiter and Lunar 3 was not fogged. Number 3, the moon's surface during the daytime is so hot that camera film would have melted. There is no atmosphere to efficiently bind lunar surface heat to devices that are not in direct contact with it. In a vacuum, only radiation remains as a heat transfer mechanism. The physics of radiative heat transfer are thoroughly understood, and the proper use of optical coatings and paints was enough to control the temperature of the film within the cameras. Lunar module temperatures were controlled with similar coatings that gave them a gold colour. Also, while the moon's surface does get very hot at lunar noon, every Apollo landing was made shortly after lunar sunrise at the landing site. The moon's day is about 29.5 Earth days long, meaning that one moon day lasts nearly 15 Earth days. During the longest days, the astronauts did notice increased cooling loads on their spacesuits as the sun and surface temperature continued to rise, but the effect was easily countered by the passive and active cooling systems. The film was not in direct sunlight, so it was not overheated. Blimey, this I'm just gonna apologise broadly for any further stomach noises. I haven't eaten and this coffee is clearly not agreeing with me. Number 4, the Apollo 16 crew could not have survived a big solar flare firing out when they were on their way to the moon. But the rebuttal is no large solar flare occurred during the flight of Apollo 16. There were large solar flares in August 1972, after Apollo 16 returned to Earth and before the flight of Apollo 17. Number 5. The flag placed on the surface by the astronauts fluttered despite there being no wind on the moon. This suggests that it was filmed on Earth and a breeze caused the flag to flutter. Sibrel said that it may have been caused by indoor fans used to cool the astronauts, since their spacesuit cooling systems would have been too heavy on Earth. The counterclaim is the flag was fastened to a D-shaped rod so that it did not hang down. The flag only seemed to flutter when the astronauts were moving it into position. Without air drag, these movements caused the free corner of the flag to swing like a pendulum for some time. The flag was rippled because it had been folded during storage. The ripples could be mistaken for movement in a still photo. Videos show that when the astronauts let go of the flagpole, it vibrates briefly, then remains still. Number 6. Footprints in the moon dust are unexpectedly well preserved despite the lack of moisture. But moon dust has not been weathered like Earth sand and has sharp edges. This allows the dust particles to stick together and hold their shape in the vacuum. The astronauts likened it to talcum powder on wet sand. Number 7. The alleged moon landings used either a sound stage or were filmed outside in a remote desert, with the astronauts either using harnesses or slow motion photography to make it look like they were on the moon. While the HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon and a scene from the movie Apollo 13 used the soundstage and harness setup, it is clearly seen from those films that when dust rose, it did not quickly settle. Some dust briefly formed clouds. In the film footage from the Apollo missions, dust kicked up by the astronauts' boots and the wheels of the lunar roving vehicles rose quite high due to the lower lunar gravity and settled quickly to the ground in an uninterrupted parabolic arc, since there was no air to suspend the dust. Even if there had been a soundstage for Hoax moon landings that had the air pumped out, the dust would have reached nowhere near the height and trajectory in the Apollo film footage because of Earth's greater gravity. So, the next section of claims are all to do with mechanical issues. So number 1, the lunar modules made no blast craters or any sign of dust scatter. The rebuttal is no crater should be expected. The 10,000-pound thrust descent propulsion system was throttled very far down during the final landing. The lunar module was no longer quickly decelerating, so the descent engine only had to support the lander's own weight, which was lessened by the moon's gravity and by the near exhaustion of the descent propellants. At landing, the engine thrust divided by the nozzle exit area is only about 1.5 psi. Beyond the engine nozzle, the bloom spreads and the pressure drops very quickly. Rocket exhaust gases expand much more quickly after leaving the engine nozzle in a vacuum than in an atmosphere. The effect of an atmosphere on rocket blooms can be easily seen in launches from Earth. As the rocket rises through the thinning atmosphere, the exhaust plumes broaden very noticeably. To lessen this, rocket engines made for vacuum explain surface dust, as seen in 16mm movies of each landing, and many mission commanders spoke of its effect on visibility. The landers were generally moving horizontally, as well as vertically, and photos do show scouring of the surface along the final descent path. Finally, the lunar regolith is very compact below its surface dust layer, making it impossible for the descent engine to blast out a crater. A blast crater was measured under the Apollo 11 lander using shadow lengths of the descent engine bell, and estimates of the amount that the landing gear had compressed and how deep the lander footpads had pressed into the lunar surface, and it was found that the engine had eroded between 100 and 150mm of regolith out from underneath the engine belt during the final descent and landing. So, to put it bluntly, no crater, but did leave a mark, essentially. Number 2, the second stage. Oh, I'm not even... Number 2, the second stage of the launch rocket, or the Lunar Module ascent stage, or both, made no visible flame. The rebuttal is the Lunar Modules used Aerosine 50 and dinitrogen tetroxide propellants chosen for simplicity and reliability. They ignite hypergolically, meaning upon contact without the need for a spark. These propellants produced a nearly transparent exhaust. The same fuel was used by the core of the American Titan II rocket. Number 3, the lunar modules weighed 17 tons and made no mark on the moon dust, yet footprints can be seen beside them. On the surface of the Earth, Apollo 11's fueled and crewed lunar module Eagle would have weighed approximately 17 short tons, or 15,000 kilograms. On the surface of the moon, however, after expanding fuel and oxidizer on its descent from lunar orbit, the lander weighed about 1,200 kilograms. The astronauts were much lighter than the lander, but their boots were much smaller than the lander's approximately 91 centimeter footpads. Pressure, or force per unit area, rather than mass, determines the amount of regolith compression. In some photos, the footpads did press into the regolith, especially when they moved sideways at touchdown. And number 4, the air conditioning units that were part of the astronauts' spacesuits could not have worked in an environment of no atmosphere. But the rebuttal is the cooling units could only work in a vacuum. Water from a tank in the backpack flowed out through tiny pores in a metal sublimator plate, where it quickly vaporized into space. The loss of the heat of vaporization froze the remaining water, forming a layer of ice on the outside of the plate that also sublimated into space, turning from a solid directly into a gas. A separate water loop flowed through the liquid cooling garment worn by the astronaut, carrying his metabolic waste heat through the sublimator plate, where it was cooled and returned to the LCG. The 5.4 kilograms of feed water gave about 8 hours of cooling. Because of its bulk, it was often the limiting consumable on the length of an EVA. The next section of conspiracy theories are concerned with transmissions. Beginning with, there should have been more than a 2-second delay in communications between Earth and the Moon, at a distance of 400,000 kilometers. The rebuttal is the round-trip light travel time of more than 2 seconds is apparent in all the real-time recordings of the lunar audio, but this does not always appear as expected. There may also be some documentary films where the delay has been edited out. Reasons for editing the audio may be time constraints or in the interest of clarity. Number 2. Sorry if you can hear the wind. Typical delays in communication were about 0.5 seconds. But the counterclaim claims that the delays were only half a second untrue, as examination of the original recordings shows. Also, there should not be a consistent time delay between every response, as the conversation is being recorded at one end. Responses from mission control could be heard without any delay, as the recording is being made at the same time that Houston receives the transmission from the moon. Number 3. The Parkes Observatory in Australia was billed to the world for weeks as the site that would be relaying communications from the first moonwalk. However, 5 hours before transmission they were told to stand down. But apparently this was because the timing of the first moonwalk was changed after the landing. In fact, delays in getting the moonwalk started meant that Parkes did cover almost the entire Apollo 11 moonwalk. And number 4, Parkes supposedly had the clearest video feed from the moon, but Australian media and all other known sources run a live feed from the United States. But the counter-argument is, while that was the original plan, and according to some sources the official policy, the Australian Broadcasting Commission did take the transmission direct from the Parkes and Honeysuckle Creek radio telescopes. These were converted to NTSC television at Paddington in Sydney. This meant that Australian viewers saw the moonwalk several seconds before the rest of the world. And number 5, a better signal was supposedly received at Parkes Observatory when the moon was on the opposite side of the planet. But apparently this is not supported by the detailed evidence and logs from the mission. And is this the final? This is one of the last few sections now. So we have missing data. Some blueprints and design and development drawings of the machines involved are missing. Apollo 11 data tapes containing telemetry and the high quality video of the first moonwalk are also missing. So tapes. Dr. David R. Williams, a NASA archivist at Goddard Space Flight Center, and Apollo 11 flight director Eugene Kranz both acknowledged that the original high-quality Apollo 11 telemetry data tapes are missing. Conspiracists see this as evidence that they never existed. The Apollo 11 telemetry tapes were different from the telemetry tapes of the other moon landings because they contained the raw television broadcast. For technical reasons, the Apollo 11 lander carried a slow-scan television camera. To broadcast the pictures to regular television, a scan conversion had to be done. The radio telescope at Parkes Observatory in Australia was able to receive the telemetry from the moon at the time of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. Parkes had a bigger antenna than NASA's antenna in Australia at the Honeysuckle Creek tracking station, so it received a better picture. It also received a better picture than NASA's antenna at Goulston Deep Space Communications Complex. This direct TV signal, along with telemetry data, was recorded onto 1-inch 14-track analog tape at Parkes. The original SSTV transmission had better detail and contrast than the scan-converted pictures, and it is this original tape that is missing. A crude real-time scan conversion of the SSTV signal was done in Australia before it was broadcast worldwide. However, still photos of the original SSTV images are available. About 15 minutes of it were filmed by an amateur 8mm reasons. The tapes contain the original and highest quality video feed from the Apollo 11 landing. Some former Apollo personnel want to find the tapes for posterity, while NASA engineers looking towards future moon missions believe the tapes may be useful for their design studies. They have found that the Apollo 11 tapes were sent for storage at the US National Archives in 1970, but by 1984, all the Apollo 11 tapes had been returned to the Goddard Space Flight Center at their request. The tapes are believed to have been stored rather than reused. Goddard was storing 35,000 new tapes per year in 1967, even before the moon landings. In November 2006, Cosmos Online reported that about 100 data tapes recorded in Australia during the Apollo 11 mission had been found in a small marine science laboratory in the main physics building at the Curtin University of Technology in Perth, Australia. One of the old tapes has been sent to NASA for analysis. The slow scan television images were not on the tape. In July 2009, NASA indicated that it must have erased the original Apollo 11 moon footage years ago so that it could reuse the tape. It's like recording over your wedding video. In December 2009, NASA issued a final report on the Apollo 11 telemetry tapes. Senior engineer Dick Navska, who was in charge of the live TV recordings during the Apollo missions, was put in charge of the restoration project. After a 3-year search, the inescapable conclusion was that about 45 tapes of Apollo 11 video were erased and reused, said Navska. In time for the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, Lowry Digital had been tasked with restoring the surviving footage. Lowry Digital President Mike Inchalik said that this is by far and away the lowest quality video the company has dealt with. Navska praised Lowry for restoring crispness to the Apollo video, which will remain in black and white and contains conservative digital enhancements. The $230,000 restoration project took months to complete and did not include sound quality improvements. Some selections of restored footage in high definition have been made available on the NASA website. So to me, that feels really, really odd. Like, we're talking about NASA, the US government, right? And apparently they didn't have enough tapes. So what do? Oh yes, let's delete and record over tapes of the first moonwalk on the moon, the first landing on the moon. Like, that just feels really odd to me. But maybe it was common practice back then. I don't know. So, there are a few other elements to conspiracy claims, like various suspicious deaths of NASA personnel, and more of a. We touched on it earlier a little bit, but comparing the USSR's technology to NASA's. But the one little theory I want to finish with is yes, the alleged Stanley Kubrick involvement. Filmmaker Stanley Kubrick is accused of having produced much of the footage for the Apollos 11 and 12, presumably because he had just directed 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is partly set on the moon and featured advanced special effects. It has been claimed that when 2001 was in post-production in early 1968, NASA secretly approached Kubrick to direct the first 3 moon landings. The launch and splashdown would be real, but the spacecraft would stay in Earth orbit and fake footage broadcast as live from the moon. was offered for this theory, which overlooks many facts. For example, 2001 was released before the first Apollo landing, and Kubrick's depiction of the moon's surface differs greatly from its appearance in the Apollo footage. The movement of characters on the moon in 2001 differs from that of the filmed movement of Apollo astronauts, and does not resemble an environment with a sixth the gravity of Earth. Several scenes in 2001 show dust billowing as spacecraft landed, something that would not happen in the vacuum environment of the moon. Kubrick did hire Frederick Ordway and Harry Launch, both of whom had worked for NASA and major aerospace contractors, to work with him on 2001. Kubrick also used some 50mm lenses that were left over from a batch made by Size 4 NASA. However, Kubrick only got this lens for Barry Lyndon, 1975. The lens was originally a still photo lens and needed changes to be used for motion filming. The mockumentary based on this idea, Dark Side of the Moon, could have fueled this conspiracy theory. This French mockumentary, directed by William Carell, was originally aired on Arte Channel in 2002, with the title Opération Lune. It parodies conspiracy theories with faked interviews, stories of assassinations of Stanley Kubrick's assistants by the CIA, and a variety of conspicuous mistakes, puns, and references to old movie characters, inserted through the film as clues for the viewer. Nevertheless, Operation Loon is still taken at face value by some conspiracy believers. An article titled Stanley Kubrick and the Moon Hoax appeared on Usenet in 1995 in the newsgroup Alt Humor Best of Usenet. One passage on how Kubrick was supposedly coerced in the conspiracy reads, NASA further leveraged their position by threatening to publicly reveal the heavy involvement of Mr. Kubrick's younger brother, Raoul, with the American Communist Party. This would have been an intolerable embarrassment to Mr. Kubrick, especially since the release of Dr. Strangelove. Kubrick had no such brother. The article was a spoof, complete with a giveaway sentence describing Kubrick shooting the moonwalk on location on the moon. Nevertheless, the claim was taken up in earnest. Clyde Lewis used it almost word for word, whereas Jay Widener gave the brother a more senior status within the party, stating, "No one knows how the powers that be convinced Kubrick to direct the Apollo landings. Maybe they had compromised Kubrick in some way. The fact that his brother Raoul Kubrick was the head of the American Communist Party may have been one of the avenues pursued by the government to get Stanley to cooperate." In July 2009, Widener posted on his webpage Secrets of the Shining, where he states that Kubrick's The Shining is a veiled confession of his role in the scam project. This thesis was the subject of refutation in an article published on Seeker nearly half a year later. The 2015 movie Moonwalkers is a fictional account of a CIA agent's claim of Kubrick's involvement. In December 2015, a video surfaced which allegedly shows Kubrick being interviewed shortly before his 1999 death. The video purportedly shows the director confessing to D. Patrick Murray that the Apollo moon landings had been faked. Research quickly found, however, that this video was a hoax. I think I love this aspect of the conspiracy theory so much because, I mean, this one, the Stanley Kubrick one, is absolutely a load of rubbish, but it just shows like how quickly lies can snowball and be presented as fact based on, you know, no factual information whatsoever. I just find it quite funny. 69% of the respondents said that it was possible that astronauts did not go to the moon, and 5% were unsure. Look, when I say realistically, they probably went to the moon, but out of all the conspiracies that exist in the world, i.e. Hollow Earth, Flat Earth, okay, the JFK assassination one's pretty convincing as well. Well, my mind's gone blank. What else have we done? Ancient aliens. The moon landings being faked is a theory that I can get behind more, but realistically, a lot of the rebuttals in this are probably based on science and are probably, more than likely fact. But doing history, I did a degree in history, and a lot of it, I spent a whole year doing my thesis on the Vietnam War. So feeding into that was a lot of this kind of overarching Cold War context and this intense, rivalry with the USSR. So to me, as a sort of historian who spent some time looking at the sort of events leading up to the Vietnam War and what was going on in the wider sort of geopolitical context, that 1969 moon landing just feels convenient. Convenient to win the space race, convenient as a propaganda tool, convenient as a way of distracting the American media, media and public from the massively unpopular Vietnam War, which had truly drained American resources. It just feels like a mighty convenient time for America to be like, hey, we're the first to go to this rock in space. America is mighty, and all the American people are like, oh, well, hey, good stuff. But look, that's just that. My opinion isn't based on fact, and I would not go and spread misinformation on the internet. Although I am now putting my opinion out there, but it's kind of serious, but kind of not. Which I think is kind of the bottom line with conspiracy theories. Those who wholeheartedly believe, the silly ones, are just kind of wasting their life, I guess. But equally, I think conspiracy theories, they're fun if you have fun with them, and you can kind of believe elements of them because sometimes they're argued quite well. But realistically, they're relatively harmless, I guess. But yeah, that was a detailed look at some of the conspiracy theories surrounding the moon landings. Oh, that was a long one. I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you are able